In the weeks and months following May 1975, the former territory of South Vietnam entered a period of profound transformation. The Provisional Revolutionary Government, which had operated for years as the political arm of the Southern Resistance, now assumed formal administrative authority over the region. Though in practice its activities were closely coordinated with Hanoi and the Communist Party that had guided the revolution from the north. The structures of the old Saigon government had collapsed, and in their place arose new institutions designed to consolidate revolutionary control and reshape Southern society according to socialist principles. In Saigon itself, now officially designated as Saigon Gia Dink, a military management committee functioned as the highest local authority in the immediate aftermath of the city's fall. This committee combined both military and civil powers, reflecting the transitional nature of the moment and the urgent need to maintain order while new administrative systems took root. The committee was reinforced by approximately 2,800 cadres dispatched from Northern and Central Party and state organs, specialists who formed functional subcommittees responsible for everything from economics and transportation to education and public services. Military administration extended downward through every level of Southern urban life during 1975. Districts, wards, and neighborhoods in major cities all came under this system, ensuring that security could be maintained and new policies implemented at the most local level. In parallel with these military structures, local revolutionary committees operated at commune, district, and province levels throughout the South, serving as de facto people's councils and executive committees carrying out directives from central authorities. The framework for these revolutionary local administrations had been outlined the previous year in a 1974 decree from the Provisional Revolutionary Government. This decree defined revolutionary people's councils as local state power bodies, with revolutionary people's committees acting as their executive arms. After formal reunification in 1976, these revolutionary bodies were gradually aligned with the unified system of people's councils and people's committees operating at each administrative level throughout the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The early post-war administration in Ho Chi Minh City, as the former Saigon was soon renamed, focused on practical matters of survival and stability. Public order had to be maintained in a city where millions faced uncertainty about their futures. Utilities needed restoration, and basic services such as transportation and communications had to be restarted. Revolutionary authorities issued regulations against unauthorized property seizures, emphasizing that any confiscation had to be carried out under official orders rather than through spontaneous action. Yet the transformation was not merely administrative. In May 1975, the new authorities ordered specific categories of former South Vietnamese personnel to register with local revolutionary committees. The registration lists typically included former officers of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, senior non-commissioned officers, police officials, intelligence personnel, and high-ranking civil servants. These were individuals most closely associated with the defeated regime, and the revolutionary government viewed them as requiring particular attention. Those who registered were later instructed, through announcements issued in June 1975, to report at specified times and places for what the government called re-education sessions. The term re-education, or Khai Tao in Vietnamese, described a system combining political study with labor, intended to transform the attitudes of people linked to the former regime. Government statements presented this system as a more humanitarian alternative to formal criminal penalties that might otherwise have been imposed on those considered war criminals. The Hanoi government characterized re-education as necessary to eliminate counter-revolutionary thinking among former officials and to secure political stability in the newly reunified South. A memorandum sent to Amnesty International in 1981 would later describe the detainees as war criminals under a 1967 North Vietnamese law, though it emphasized they were receiving re-education rather than formal punishment. The theoretical guidance described the system as combining productive labor with political education and cultural classes. The re-education system drew on earlier North Vietnamese experience with similar institutions used during the 1960s for former colonial-era officials and political opponents. One northern precedent, Resolution 49, had envisaged 3 years of educational reform with possible early release for those showing genuine reform. Initial instructions indicated that ordinary soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and rank-and-file police were to attend 3-day reform study courses, often as day programs where participants returned home each night. Higher-ranking officers, senior police officials, and intelligence personnel were ordered to report for longer sessions extending weeks or months. In June 1976, the Provisional Revolutionary Government issued a statement suggesting that those in re-education camps would be either tried or released after 3 years, though subsequent practice would often diverge from this timeline. The statement claimed that about 95% of those attending shorter reform courses had already had their cases examined and their civic rights restored. For many, however, the reality would prove far more prolonged than these official statements suggested. Research suggests that up to 300,000 people associated with the former South Vietnamese government and military were interned in re-education camps at some point after 1975. Many detainees spent between 4 and 8 years in the camps, though some were held for shorter periods and others considerably longer. Amnesty International's 1990 report noted that thousands of former civil servants and armed forces members had been summoned for re-education after 1975, with many still detained years later. The re-education facilities, commonly called Trại Cải Tạo or reform camps, were typically operated by the Ministry of Interior along with military and public security units. Camps were located in multiple provinces, including remote, rural, and mountainous areas. In addition to long-term camps, shorter study sessions were held in schools, offices, or local halls for those in lower priority categories who were deemed less in need of intensive reform. The curriculum combined political lectures about the revolution and party policy with group discussions, self-criticism sessions, and detailed reports on personal histories. Detainees were expected to examine their past actions and demonstrate commitment to reform. Official guidelines called for productive labor, such as agriculture or construction, alongside political study. Violations of camp rules could result in administrative sanctions or referral to people's courts for more serious offenses. The government periodically announced amnesties or phased releases, with some prisoners freed around major political anniversaries. Many of those eventually released would later emigrate under international agreements, including the released re-education detainee program that the United States established in 1989, requiring applicants to have spent at least 3 years in internment. In parallel with re-education, authorities undertook systematic vetting and reassignment of former civil servants. Lower-level technical staff were often retained under new supervision, particularly in essential services. Higher-ranking officials were more likely to be removed and directed to re-education, new assignments, or rural relocation. The unified state structure after 1976 placed all local administration under people's councils and people's committees at province, district, and commune levels. Courts and procuracies in the South were reorganized into a unified system subordinate to the Supreme People's Court and Supreme People's Procuracy. Public security was integrated into a nationwide Ministry of Public Security, combining former Provisional Revolutionary Government forces with Northern internal security structures. Revolutionary mass organizations expanded into the South to mobilize support and monitor policy implementation. The Vietnam Fatherland Front and its associated unions established presence throughout the region. Party cells were created within former South Vietnamese institutions, including factories, schools, and government offices. Ideological education campaigns promoted Marxism-Leninism, Ho Chi Minh thought, and narratives of national liberation and reunification. Former soldiers not subject to long-term re-education were encouraged or required to join production units, agricultural cooperatives, or other labor collectives. Policies toward religious organizations combined legal recognition with tighter supervision and expectations of political loyalty. International observers in the late 1970s noted that large numbers of former officials and soldiers remained in re-education camps years after the war's end. The consolidation of revolutionary control over this once separate territory would continue to unfold in the difficult years ahead. After reunification in 1976, Vietnam adopted a unified, centrally planned economic model based on state ownership of the main means of production and nationwide economic planning. The Vietnamese Communist Party's Fourth National Congress in December 1976 formally endorsed what it called a line of building a socialist economy for the entire country. This marked the official extension of the North's economic system to the formerly capitalist South, a transformation that would reshape the lives of millions of people and generate consequences both intended and unforeseen. The second five-year plan, covering 1976 through 1980, was the first plan applied to all of Vietnam, integrating the previously separate northern and southern economies into a single socialist framework. The plan set ambitious targets, calling for average annual industrial growth of 16 to 18%, agricultural growth of 8 to 10%, and national income growth of 13 to 14%. Plan priorities included post-war reconstruction, development of agriculture, integration of North and South, and accelerated communization of the Southern economy. Post-1975 policy extended the North's earlier system of state-owned industry, collectivized agriculture, and state-controlled commerce to the former South. The government nationalized most private industrial and commercial enterprises in the South between 1975 and 1979 as part of what officials termed socialist transformation. A government account later noted that after 4 years, socialist transformation in industry and commerce and agricultural cooperatives in the South was basically achieved. The speed and scale of this transformation would have profound effects on Southern society. Central planning organs in Hanoi set enterprise output targets, allocated inputs, and controlled prices, while enterprises received subsidies to cover losses when they could not operate profitably under these constraints. Foreign trade was made a state monopoly, with central agencies determining both import composition and export destinations. Before reunification, state-owned industry in the North had already accounted for about 72% of industrial output by 1974, with private and individual enterprises at just over 2% and cooperatives at about a quarter of the total. After 1975, state ownership of industry was extended to the South through nationalization of factories, banks, and large commercial houses that had formerly operated under Saigon's control. Many foreign-owned or joint venture enterprises in the South were expropriated or taken over by the new government as part of these nationalization measures. In March 1978, the government announced large-scale nationalization of commerce in the South, targeting wholesale and major retail trading firms. This brought many former private traders and shop owners into newly created state commercial enterprises or cooperatives. State commercial agencies were tasked with purchasing agricultural products from cooperatives and small producers at set prices and distributing consumer goods through official channels. In industry, the government emphasized reconstruction of war-damaged plants and expansion of heavy industry, often with Soviet and Eastern Bloc assistance. State investment in the late 1970s reached about 19% of national income, financed partly by foreign aid and concessional loans from socialist allies. Despite high investment ratios, many Second Plan industrial targets were not met. Output was constrained by energy shortages, lack of spare parts, and insufficient raw materials. Southern industry failed to recover fully, contributing to continued shortages of consumer goods and light manufactures that the population needed for daily life. The economy struggled under the weight of damaged infrastructure, limited technical capacity, and the considerable challenges of integrating two very different economic systems under wartime conditions and with limited resources. Agricultural collectivization had largely been completed in the North by the mid-1960s, but the South remained dominated by smallholder and market-oriented agriculture until 1975. After reunification, the government launched campaigns to extend agricultural cooperatives and collectives to the Mekong Delta and other southern regions. By the end of 1985, official figures reported that about 72% of peasant households in the South had joined some form of cooperative organization. Southern cooperatives typically pooled land, draft animals, and equipment, with members receiving work points or shares for their labor contributions. State procurement quotas required cooperatives to deliver specified amounts of rice and other staples to the state at administratively determined prices, often below market value. The state used these procured quantities to supply ration systems in urban areas and to support industrial workers at subsidized prices, maintaining social stability through controlled distribution. Government assessments later acknowledged that collectivization in the North between 1960 and 1975 did not generate the large agricultural surpluses originally expected. After 1975, food output increased with the addition of the South's fertile Mekong Delta, but still fell short of providing abundant surplus for industrial financing as planners had hoped. To secure enough grain to supply cities and the army, the state sometimes had to pay high procurement prices and import food, straining the already tight budget. Resettlement to new economic zones, often involving moving households from crowded cities or poor rural areas to frontier lands, was used to support agricultural expansion and address urban unemployment. The third five-year plan, covering 1981 through 1985, was discussed at the Fifth Party Congress in March 1982 and aimed to address problems revealed by the second plan's significant shortfalls. Because of the earlier failures, the third plan was implemented cautiously, with full plan documents not presented as a single package to the National Assembly. Third plan resolutions sought to increase food production, light industry output, and exports, while still pursuing long-term socialist industrialization. Policy debates inside the leadership weighed whether to retain or restrict private capitalist activities in the South and how fast to complete its socialist transformation. The compromise adopted allowed temporary retention of some private capitalist activities to stimulate production, but still aimed to complete transformation of the South by the mid-1980s. Late in 1983, several import-export firms created in Ho Chi Minh City to boost exports were merged into a single state-regulated enterprise, reducing local autonomy and entrepreneurial initiative. At the same time, the pace of rural collectivization in the South was accelerated, contributing to the reported 72% cooperative enrollment by 1985. In 1981, Decision 25CP introduced measures to give state-owned factories more initiative in production and financial self-management. Under this decision, factories could prepare three-part plans consisting of state-assigned tasks, self-devised production, and a third plan for auxiliary activities. These reforms allowed enterprises limited flexibility to procure inputs and sell part of their output outside rigid state quotas, aiming to raise efficiency. Despite these adjustments, Vietnam's economy from 1976 through 1985 faced chronic problems, including low labor productivity, underutilized capacity, and persistent shortages of food, fuel, and consumer goods that affected households across the country. A study of the period found that average gross national product growth was roughly half the rate of population growth, and national income grew at about 1/5 of target levels. Official and external analyses in the early 1980s noted persistent unemployment and underemployment, especially among urban youth and demobilized soldiers struggling to find their place in the socialist economy. Material and technological shortages, such as lack of spare parts, modern machinery, and fertilizers, limited both industrial and agricultural performance. In March 1981, a Soviet-Vietnamese protocol on coordination of state plans set explicit bilateral trade and aid targets, highlighting the country's external dependence on its socialist allies. The Soviet Union and its partners supplied oil, machinery, and industrial equipment on concessional terms, while importing Vietnamese commodities like rice and coal. By the early 1980s, the state budget was burdened by subsidies for food, consumer goods, and loss-making state enterprises that could not sustain themselves under the constraints of central planning. Inflationary pressures grew over the period, and by 1985, price, wage, and currency reforms intended to improve management instead contributed to a troubling spike in inflation that disrupted economic life across the country. The 1985 reforms included a major currency redenomination and attempts to unify official and black market prices, but they failed to stabilize the economy as hoped. Economists and official narratives later cited the difficulties of this period under central planning, extensive collectivization, and heavy state control as key background to the renovation reforms that would be launched in 1986 under the banner of Do Moi. The term Vietnamese boat people refers to the refugees who fled Vietnam by sea in large numbers after the end of the Vietnam War, beginning in 1975 and peaking in the late 1970s. Statistics from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees indicate that from 1975 to 1997, over 839,000 Vietnamese arrived in camps across Southeast Asia and Hong Kong, mostly by boat. Between 1975 and 1995, almost 800,000 Vietnamese boat people are recorded as having arrived safely in another country, though this figure excludes those who died or disappeared during the perilous crossings. One estimate suggests that between 200,000 and 250,000 Vietnamese boat people died at sea, though exact numbers remain uncertain and may never be fully known. The Vietnamese refugee crisis has been described as one of the most protracted refugee problems in history, lasting from the mid-1970s into the 1990s. and involving multiple waves of departure under changing circumstances. Analysts and researchers have identified a combination of political, economic, and social factors as drivers of the boat people exodus rather than any single cause. The establishment of a unified communist state after 1975 and the elimination of the former South Vietnamese regime created fears among former officials and soldiers about their future treatment under the new order that now controlled every aspect of Vietnamese society. The system of re-education for former officers, police, and civil servants involving periods of detention and political indoctrination was one major political factor cited by many refugees when explaining their decision to leave. Reports indicated that large numbers of former South Vietnamese personnel were still in re-education camps years after 1975, contributing to continued anxiety among their families and networks who wondered when or whether their loved ones would return. Many former officers and officials associated re-education, surveillance, and limited rights with a lack of future prospects within Vietnam under communist rule. Economic restructuring after 1975, including nationalization of industry and commerce, disrupted livelihoods for urban merchants, small traders, and private business owners, especially in the South, where capitalism had flourished for decades under the Republic of Vietnam. Socialist reforms in 1977 and 1978 restricted certain employment to Vietnamese nationals and ended many forms of small capitalism, leading to widespread closure of small businesses that had sustained families for generations. Many refugees interviewed later cited loss of property, business confiscations, and lack of legal space for private commerce as key reasons for deciding to leave their homeland and seek new lives elsewhere. The extension of collectivized agriculture and state procurement quotas to southern rural areas reduced autonomy for farmers and contributed to some rural households joining the outward migration flows. Chronic shortages of consumer goods, fuel, and food under central planning in the late 1970s and early 1980s reinforced perceptions of limited economic opportunities for those who remained. By the early 1980s, average national income growth lagged behind population growth, and living standards were under significant strain throughout the country. For many urban Vietnamese, particularly in Ho Chi Minh City, the combination of rationing, state job allocation, and restrictions on private enterprise encouraged people to seek futures abroad where their skills and initiative might be rewarded. The construction of new economic zones involving relocation of urban residents or former regime affiliates to remote rural areas is often cited in refugee testimony as a significant push factor. These zones were part of both agricultural expansion and social reorganization, but many assigned there experienced dissatisfaction with the harsh conditions and lack of resources. Environmental and agricultural disruption from wartime defoliation and bombing, alongside post-war economic policies, has also been discussed in scholarship as a background factor influencing migration decisions for rural families whose lands had been damaged. Former South Vietnamese officers, soldiers, police, and civil servants were disproportionately represented among early departures, reflecting concerns about political screening and re-education. Some re-education returnees, facing restrictions on employment, travel, or residence after their release, later chose to leave the country when opportunities arose. Families of high-ranking former officials and business owners sometimes left collectively, motivated by fear of future confiscations, monitoring, or renewed detentions. The ethnic Chinese community known as the Hoa, particularly in the South, was heavily involved in trade and commerce and faced especially strong impact from post-1975 nationalization policies that targeted their businesses and savings. In the late 1970s, many Hoa reported that heavy taxes, restrictions on trade, and confiscation of businesses had undermined their economic security built over decades. They were also affected by broader anti-bourgeois measures aimed at private capitalists across all ethnic groups in the socialist transformation. Following deteriorating Sino-Vietnamese relations and the border war of 1979, the Hoa were increasingly regarded by Vietnamese authorities as a potential security risk due to their ethnic ties to China. Border clashes and disputes over Cambodia in 1978 and 1979 further intensified official suspicion toward ethnic Chinese communities near the border and in major southern cities. Policy measures and social pressure combined to encourage many Hoa to leave, often via overland routes to China or by boat to Southeast Asia. By the end of 1979, about 250,000 Hoa had sought refuge in China, and many tens of thousands more were among boat people in regional camps. Official Vietnamese policies in 1978 and 1979 sometimes linked permission to leave the country with significant payments in gold or foreign currency, especially for relatively well-off Hoa families who had managed to preserve some wealth. Reports describe fees on the order of $1,500 to $3,000 per adult being paid for documentation and passage on boats, often in gold. This practice allowed some officials and intermediaries to profit from the organized departure of those able to pay, while poorer Vietnamese departed clandestinely without papers and at greater risk. The organized exit system thus combined political pressures with economic extraction, making departure both a risk and a business opportunity for certain actors. Many poorer Vietnamese who lacked funds for such arrangements used small, often overcrowded boats, which were more vulnerable to dangers at sea, including storms, pirates, and mechanical failures. The decision to leave often involved extended family networks, pooling resources to send some members out first, hoping they could later sponsor others through legal channels once established abroad. Informal networks in coastal towns such as Vung Tau, Raik Ja, and areas near the Mekong Delta helped organize clandestine departures, often in cooperation with boat owners and local contacts who knew the waters and could evade patrols. Some accounts describe cooperation among ethnic Chinese merchants and fishing boat operators in arranging passages from ports in and around Ho Chi Minh City's Cha Lan district. The presence of existing Vietnamese communities abroad, especially in the United States, France, and Australia, also encouraged later departures through promises of sponsorship or support upon arrival. The Orderly Departure Program, established in 1979 through agreements between UNHCR and Vietnam, provided a legal channel for some Vietnamese to leave directly for resettlement countries, reducing but not ending clandestine boat departures. Although a few thousand people fled Vietnam by boat between 1975 and mid-1978, the major exodus is generally dated to around September 1978. The arrival of the vessel Southern Cross in September 1978, carrying about 1,200 Vietnamese to an uninhabited Indonesian island, drew international attention to the scale of the emerging crisis. By June 1979, monthly arrivals of Vietnamese boat people in Southeast Asia peaked at about 54,000 individuals in a single month. At that mid-1979 high point, an estimated 350,000 Vietnamese boat people were in refugee camps across Southeast Asia and Hong Kong. Governments in the region declared that they had reached the limit of their capacity and announced that they would no longer accept new arrivals without stronger international resettlement commitments. International conferences in 1979 led to increased resettlement pledges by Western and other countries, helping to reduce pressure on first asylum states, though departures from Vietnam continued for years afterward. One migration study estimates that between 1975 and 1987, more than 1 million Vietnamese left the country as refugees, including both boat and land departures. Of the hundreds of thousands who arrived in camps, the vast majority were eventually resettled abroad, while a smaller number were repatriated to Vietnam under later arrangements. The exodus was driven by a combination of post-war political controls, economic restructuring and hardship, ethnic tensions especially involving the Hoa, and the availability of both clandestine and organized channels for departure. Vietnamese boat people departed mainly from Vietnam's southern and central coasts, including areas around Ho Chi Minh City, Vung Tau, Rạch Gia, and the Mekong Delta, where fishing communities provided both knowledge of the sea and access to vessels. Some organized escape networks also moved people overland from Saigon to Da Nang and other central ports before boarding fishing junks or trawlers for departure. Typical sea routes ran across the South China Sea or Gulf of Thailand toward nearby coasts in Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Hong Kong, journeys that could take days or weeks depending on weather and the condition of the often overcrowded and poorly maintained boats. Of the total Vietnamese who arrived in camps during this period, over 42,000 reached Thailand by land rather than by sea, usually traveling through Cambodia and making short coastal crossings. The first Vietnamese boat people reached Malaysia in May 1975, landing on the country's east coast shortly after the fall of Saigon when the first wave of refugees began their desperate flights from the newly unified Vietnam. Malaysia hosted nearly 255,000 Vietnamese boat people between 1975 and 1996, providing temporary asylum in cooperation with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. At the peak of arrivals, Malaysia operated 8 refugee camps for boat people along its east coast and in the states of Sabah and Sarawak. Over 248,000 Vietnamese who passed through Malaysia were eventually resettled in Western countries, while just over 9,000 were repatriated to Vietnam under later arrangements. Malaysia's last Vietnamese boat people camp at Sungai Besi was formally closed on the 25th of June 1996, marking the end of a 21-year involvement in the refugee crisis. Hong Kong began receiving Vietnamese boat people in 1975 and became one of the major destinations and holding points during the crisis due to its location and status as a British territory. Between 1975 and 1995, roughly 67,000 Vietnamese passed through Hong Kong, according to later summaries. Large shipborne incidents, such as the 1978 and 1979 arrivals of the Huey Phong and other freighters carrying thousands of Vietnamese, led to high-profile standoffs over disembarkation that drew international attention to the scale of the exodus. By the late 1980s, Hong Kong implemented a closed camp policy for new arrivals, with detention-style facilities holding refugees pending status determination and either resettlement or return. Under the Comprehensive Plan of Action after 1989, Hong Kong screened Vietnamese arrivals for refugee status and repatriated those screened out as non-refugees who did not qualify for resettlement abroad. Indonesia hosted Indo-Chinese refugees, mainly at Galang Refugee Camp on Galang Island, part of the Riau Archipelago near Singapore in the waters between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. Galang Camp operated from 1979 to 1996 and is estimated to have accommodated around 250,000 Indo-Chinese refugees, most of them Vietnamese boat people seeking passage to new lives in distant lands. The Galang site covered about 16 square kilometers, roughly 20% of the island's total area. Galang was divided into three main areas designated Site IA, Site IB, and Site 2, used for different waves or categories of refugees as the camp evolved over the years. Camp facilities on Galang included an administration office, an Indonesian Red Cross hospital, schools, churches, a Buddhist temple, a cemetery, and a youth center organized by refugees themselves who created community structures within the camp's boundaries. The Philippines also served as a processing and transit country for Vietnamese boat people, hosting camps such as the Bataan Refugee Processing Center on the main island of Luzon. Bataan was used primarily as a processing and orientation site, where refugees received language and cultural training before resettlement abroad to prepare them for life in their new countries. By mid-1996, estimates suggested about 2,300 Vietnamese remained in camps in the Philippines awaiting repatriation or resettlement as the crisis wound down. Thailand hosted over 150,000 refugees from Vietnam and other Indo-Chinese countries at the height of the crisis, with multiple camps along the Gulf of Thailand coast and in inland areas near the Cambodian border. Singapore took in smaller numbers of Vietnamese boat people, generally as a short-term first asylum and transit point before transfer to larger camps in neighboring countries that had more capacity for long-term processing and resettlement work. By the end of 1978, there were nearly 62,000 Vietnamese boat people in refugee camps throughout Southeast Asia. Monthly arrivals peaked in June 1979, when about 54,000 people arrived by boat in Southeast Asia in a single month, overwhelming the capacity of receiving countries. At mid-1979, roughly 350,000 Vietnamese boat people and other Indo-Chinese refugees were in camps across the region and in Hong Kong. The first Indo-Chinese Refugee Conference in Geneva in July 1979 led to increased resettlement pledges by Western countries and affirmed a first asylum policy for Southeast Asian states that agreed not to turn away boats in exchange for international support. Following the 1979 conference, resettlement rates increased, easing overcrowding somewhat in first asylum camps by the early 1980s. Refugee camps generally followed procedures of initial registration, basic health screening, and documentation upon arrival to process the thousands arriving each month. The camps were jointly administered by UNHCR, host governments, and non-governmental organizations, providing shelter, food rations, and primary medical care to those awaiting decisions on their futures. Most refugees stayed in camps for months and in many cases years before either resettlement abroad or repatriation, living in uncertain limbo between their past and unknown futures. Over time, many camps developed internal community structures, including refugee-run schools, religious centers, and social organizations operating under camp regulations that gave some order to daily life. Education and language classes in camps often focused on English, French, or the language of intended resettlement countries to help integration after arrival in new homelands. By the mid-1980s, the willingness of Western countries to accept all Vietnamese arriving by boat as refugees had declined, contributing to significant policy changes in how arrivals were processed and categorized. In June 1989, a second international conference in Geneva adopted the Comprehensive Plan of Action for Indo-Chinese Refugees, fundamentally changing how the crisis would be managed going forward. The Comprehensive Plan of Action introduced a screening process in first asylum countries to distinguish refugees who were eligible for resettlement from non-refugees who would be repatriated to their home countries. Under this plan, UNHCR monitored repatriations and provided assistance to returnees and their communities in Vietnam and Laos. The arrangements under the Comprehensive Plan of Action were in effect from 1989 until 1996, when remaining Vietnamese boat people camps in Southeast Asia and Hong Kong finally closed. The plan's 5 components included screening, resettlement, repatriation, international assistance, and monitoring in countries of origin. First asylum countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Hong Kong agreed under the plan not to push back new arrivals, but gained the ability to repatriate those screened out as non-refugees. Camps under the Comprehensive Plan of Action typically had separate areas for those awaiting screening, for recognized refugees pending resettlement, and for persons accepted or preparing for repatriation to Vietnam. Appeal procedures were established for negative screening decisions, although acceptance rates varied by time and location. By June 1996, an estimated 24,700 Vietnamese remained in camps across Southeast Asia and Hong Kong as the plan drew to a close. Of the over 839,000 Vietnamese who arrived in camps between 1975 and 1997, nearly 750,000 were eventually resettled to third countries where they built new lives. The same data show that over 109,000 Vietnamese were repatriated to Vietnam, either voluntarily or under return programs established through the Comprehensive Plan of Action. Major resettlement destinations included the United States, Canada, Australia, France, and other Western and some Asian countries that opened their doors to the refugees. The overall international response to the Vietnamese boat people crisis is often described as shifting from open-ended resettlement in the late 1970s to controlled admission and managed repatriation under the Comprehensive Plan of Action by the late 1980s. The period from 1975 through 1990 thus saw the evolution of an extensive regional camp and processing system, coordinated through UNHCR and international conferences to manage Vietnamese boat journeys, temporary asylum, and long-term solutions for those who had risked everything to flee their homeland. From 1975 into the early 1990s, Vietnamese refugees were resettled from Southeast Asian and Hong Kong camps to more than 20 countries, led by the United States, Australia, France, and Canada. These 4 largest resettlement countries together absorbed the vast majority of those who eventually found permanent homes abroad after their long journeys from Vietnam. Between July 1979 and July 1982 alone, these 4 nations together resettled over 620,000 Indo-Chinese refugees, demonstrating the remarkable scale of international commitment to resolving the humanitarian crisis. Overall estimates suggest that about 1.6 million Vietnamese were resettled abroad through organized programs by the late 1990s, though the process took decades to complete and involved complex negotiations between governments and international organizations. The United States ultimately admitted more than 1 million Vietnamese across the first 2 post-war decades, through refugee programs, parole provisions, and later family reunification channels that allowed those already settled to bring relatives to join them in their new country. In 1975, about 125,000 Vietnamese refugees arrived in the United States through a government-sponsored evacuation and resettlement program following the war's end. The Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act of 1975 provided $455 million in supplemental funds for resettlement of refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia. The act, signed on the 23rd of May 1975, authorized the admission under parole of roughly 130,000 refugees from South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and funded their transport, reception, and initial assistance. Initial U.S. processing centers for Vietnamese evacuees included Camp Pendleton in California, Fort Chaffee in Arkansas, Fort Indian Town Gap in Pennsylvania, and Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. Refugees at these centers typically received temporary housing, medical screening, basic supplies, and initial English language and cultural orientation to prepare them for life in American society. From 1975 through 2002, over 759,000 Vietnamese arrived in the United States as refugees, according to policy analyses. Between 1981 and 1990 alone, nearly 281,000 Vietnamese refugees were resettled in the United States, reflecting continued arrivals under the Orderly Departure Program and related schemes that provided legal channels for departure. U.S. resettlement policy used a dispersal strategy, assigning refugees to sponsors and communities across many states to avoid overly concentrated enclaves that might strain local resources or create social tensions. Over time, secondary migration led many Vietnamese refugees to cluster in states such as California, Texas, Virginia, and Louisiana, where existing communities and economic opportunities drew them together. By 2000, the Vietnamese-born population in the United States had reached about 988,000, representing the cumulative effect of refugee and family-based migration since 1975. The largest Vietnamese American concentration developed in Southern California, particularly Orange County, where the area around Westminster and Garden Grove became known as Little Saigon. This enclave emerged in the late 1970s and 1980s as a hub of Vietnamese-owned restaurants, grocery stores, and professional services that served both the community and curious visitors. On the U.S. East Coast, an early Vietnamese enclave developed along Wilson Boulevard in Clarendon, Arlington, Virginia, also called Little Saigon by its residents and visitors who gathered there. Clarendon's Little Saigon reached its peak from the late 1970s to mid-1980s, serving as a commercial and social center for Vietnamese from across the Mid-Atlantic region. Rising rents and redevelopment in Clarendon later pushed many Vietnamese businesses to relocate to the nearby Eden Center in Falls Church, Virginia, which became a new focal point for the community. Early Vietnamese communities in U.S. cities often formed around Catholic parishes and Buddhist temples that provided spiritual support and social services to newcomers adjusting to unfamiliar surroundings. Vietnamese mutual assistance associations and alumni groups helped new arrivals navigate employment, housing, and schooling systems in their adopted country. Many refugees with professional backgrounds initially took lower-skilled jobs because of language barriers and non-recognition of Vietnamese qualifications obtained under the former regime. U.S. federal and state programs provided English as a second language classes and job training assistance to facilitate integration into the American workforce. Over time, Vietnamese small businesses, especially restaurants, nail salons, and grocery stores, became a prominent feature of diaspora economies in many American cities and suburbs. Canada became a major resettlement destination, ultimately receiving about 100,000 to 111,000 Indo-Chinese refugees, the majority of whom were Vietnamese. Between 1975 and 1985, approximately 111,000 Indo-Chinese refugees were settled in Canada, with a peak intake of about 35,000 in 1980. Canada's 1976 Immigration Act and subsequent policies allowed for both government-assisted and privately sponsored refugees from Indochina. The Canadian Private Sponsorship Program, involving churches and community groups, is widely noted as a distinctive feature of its response to Vietnamese refugees and became a model for other countries seeking to involve civil society in resettlement efforts. Vietnamese communities in Canada concentrated in major urban centers such as Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, and Ottawa, where economic opportunities and existing networks drew newcomers. France, the former colonial power in Vietnam, resettled about 120,000 Vietnamese boat people in land arrivals between 1975 and 1997. Earlier Vietnamese communities already existed in France, particularly in Paris and certain industrial cities, due to colonial-era migration and arrivals after the 1954 partition of Vietnam. The new refugee influx after 1975 strengthened existing Vietnamese neighborhoods and created new clusters in Paris, Marseille, Lyon, and Toulouse. French resettlement policies combined state-organized reception with support from Catholic, Protestant, and secular non-governmental organizations that provided housing and services. Vietnamese in France established cultural associations, language schools, and media outlets that linked diaspora communities to developments in Vietnam and to each other across borders. Australia resettled about 108,000 Vietnamese through refugee and humanitarian programs from 1975 to the late 1990s. Vietnamese settlement in Australia concentrated in urban areas such as Sydney, particularly the suburb of Cabramatta, as well as Melbourne, Brisbane, and Adelaide. Cabramatta became the largest Vietnamese commercial and cultural center in Australia during the 1980s, developing a distinctive character that drew visitors from across the country seeking authentic Vietnamese food and goods. Australian integration programs included English language instruction, housing assistance, and employment services tailored to refugee needs. Other European countries, including West Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, and the Netherlands, also accepted smaller but significant numbers of Vietnamese refugees who established communities across the continent. West Germany received Vietnamese refugees both through resettlement from camps and as contract workers from North Vietnam under separate agreements, creating distinct diaspora subgroups with different backgrounds and experiences. The United Kingdom resettled several thousand Vietnamese, many of whom were initially housed in reception centers before dispersal to towns and cities across England and Scotland. Scandinavian countries such as Sweden, Norway, and Denmark participated in Indo-Chinese resettlement, emphasizing humanitarian admission and comprehensive integration support programs. In Asia, smaller Vietnamese communities formed in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, often through resettlement of camp refugees or later labor migration and family reunion arrangements. Selection criteria for resettlement from camps varied, but generally prioritized individuals with family links in destination countries, those with particular vulnerabilities, and those recognized as refugees under UNHCR procedures. The Orderly Departure Program, established in 1979 under UNHCR auspices, allowed Vietnamese to leave directly from Vietnam to resettlement countries without first undertaking dangerous boat journeys. Categories under this program included family reunion, former political detainees, and individuals associated with the former South Vietnamese regime or American presence. During the 8 years of the Comprehensive Plan of Action from 1989 to 1996, more than 530,000 Vietnamese and Laotian refugees were resettled from camps under managed screening and selection procedures. By 1990, sizable Vietnamese diaspora communities had been established in North America, Western Europe, and Australia, with networks of religious institutions, businesses, and associations forming the core of community life that would endure and grow in the decades ahead. After Democratic Kampuchea was established in April 1975, relations between the Khmer Rouge regime and Vietnam deteriorated rapidly over border and ideological disputes that had roots going back decades. Khmer Rouge leaders, including Pol Pot, increasingly portrayed Vietnam as a historic and eternal enemy in public statements and broadcasts, reviving ancient enmities to justify their hostile posture toward their neighbor to the east. Scattered border skirmishes between Khmer Rouge and Vietnamese forces occurred as early as 1975, becoming more frequent by 1976 as tensions escalated along the remote and poorly demarcated frontier between the two revolutionary states. From April 1977, fighting along the Cambodian-Vietnamese border intensified significantly, with continuous small, medium, and large-scale engagements reported over the following year. On the 30th of April 1977, Khmer Rouge units attacked several Vietnamese border villages in An Giang and other provinces, marking a notable escalation in the conflict that would eventually lead to full-scale war. In September 1977, the Kampuchean Revolutionary Army artillery shelled Vietnamese villages along the frontier, and 6 villages in Dung Thap province were overrun by Khmer Rouge infantry who committed atrocities against civilian populations. Shortly afterward, 6 Kampuchean Revolutionary Army divisions advanced about 10 kilometers into Tay Ninh province, where over 1,000 Vietnamese civilians were reported killed in Thanh Bien district. Cambodia's government publicly accused Vietnam in late 1977 of conducting an undeclared war, while Vietnam accused Democratic Kampuchea of repeated cross-border incursions that killed innocent Vietnamese citizens living peacefully in their villages. In response to the September and October 1977 attacks, the People's Army of Vietnam assembled 8 divisions, estimated at about 60,000 troops, for a retaliatory strike. On the 16th of December 1977, these Vietnamese divisions, supported by Vietnam People's Air Force units, crossed into Cambodia along several axes as a large-scale counterattack designed to punish the Khmer Rouge for their aggression. The December 1977 counteroffensive penetrated up to 30 to 40 kilometers inside Cambodian territory before Vietnamese units withdrew back across the border in early 1978. In April 1978, Khmer Rouge forces again attacked across the border with renewed ferocity. One major incident was the Ba Chuk massacre in An Giang province, where thousands of Vietnamese villagers were killed in brutal fashion that shocked international observers. On the 12th of April 1978, Democratic Kampuchea declared that negotiations with Vietnam were possible only if Hanoi met conditions including recognition of Kampuchean sovereignty and withdrawal from disputed areas. Vietnam rejected Phnom Penh's preconditions and accused the Khmer Rouge of continuing aggressive actions despite their diplomatic statements. In June 1978, the Vietnam People's Air Force began regular bombing of Kampuchean Revolutionary Army positions along the border, flying roughly 30 combat sorties per day on some days. By mid-1978, most surviving leaders of the Khmer Rouge Eastern Zone, who who had turned against Pol Pot in internal party struggles, had fled into Vietnam and began forming the nucleus of an anti-Khmer Rouge force that would play a crucial role in the coming invasion. On the 2nd of December 1978, Cambodian defectors and dissidents meeting in eastern Cambodia formed the Kampuchean United Front for National Salvation. The front was led by Heng Samrin and other former Khmer Rouge Eastern Zone cadres who called for the overthrow of Pol Pot and appealed for Vietnamese support in their struggle against the genocidal regime. Vietnamese sources described the front as a broad coalition of revolutionary forces and people of Kampuchea opposed to democratic Kampuchea's leadership. On the 15th of June 1978, Vietnam had already announced a policy of comprehensive people's war for national defense on the southwestern border, signaling preparations for larger operations against the Khmer Rouge regime. On the 23rd of December 1978, according to Vietnamese accounts, Khmer Rouge forces deployed 19 of 23 infantry divisions plus artillery and armor along the southwestern border and opened fire across the frontier. Vietnamese sources described their subsequent response as a large-scale counterattack, beginning on the 23rd of December 1978 to drive Khmer Rouge forces from Vietnamese territory. On the 25th of December 1978, Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion of democratic Kampuchea with approximately 13 divisions, about 100,000 to 150,000 troops, supported by armor and air units that overwhelmed the defending Khmer Rouge forces. The main Vietnamese thrusts advanced along multiple axes, including routes toward Kra Tie, Kampong Cham, and directly toward Phnom Penh. Vietnamese forces were assisted by the Kampuchean United Front for National Salvation, which provided local intelligence, political support, and additional manpower. Within 2 weeks of the 25th of December 1978 invasion, Vietnamese and front forces had overrun most organized Kampuchean Revolutionary Army resistance outside northwestern strongholds near the Thai border. On the 7th of January 1979, Vietnamese and front troops entered Phnom Penh, encountering minimal organized defense as Khmer Rouge leaders had withdrawn westward toward Thailand. Democratic Kampuchea's top leadership, including Pol Pot, Nuon Chea, and Tom Mok, fled toward bases near the Thai border and into jungle areas where they would continue resistance for years to come. After seizing Phnom Penh, Vietnamese forces continued operations into western Cambodia to destroy remaining Kampuchean Revolutionary Army units and secure key routes to the Thai frontier. The fall of Phnom Penh on the 7th of January 1979 effectively ended Democratic Kampuchea's control over most Cambodian territory, although guerrilla warfare would continue for more than a decade in the jungles and mountains. On the 1st of January 1979, shortly before Phnom Penh's capture, the Front's Central Committee issued a set of immediate policies for areas liberated from the Khmer Rouge. These policies included abolishing communal kitchens, restoring some private household activities, and re-establishing Buddhist practices to reassure the population traumatized by years of radical rule. The Front also called for the creation of people's self-management committees at village and district levels to administer local affairs. On the 8th of January 1979, the Revolutionary People's Council of Kampuchea was formed, with Heng Samrin as chairman, as a provisional government for the liberated country. On the 10th of January 1979, the new authorities proclaimed the People's Republic of Kampuchea as the country's official name. The People's Republic presented itself to the United Nations Security Council in early 1979 as the sole legitimate government of Cambodia. Vietnam was the first country to recognize the new government, quickly establishing diplomatic relations and signing cooperation agreements. On the 18th of February, 1979, Head of State Heng Samrin and Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Van Dom signed a 25-year treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation in Hanoi. Under this treaty, Vietnam and the People's Republic agreed on mutual assistance, including Vietnamese support for Cambodian security and reconstruction efforts. Vietnamese forces remained in Cambodia as an occupying and assistance force, with estimates of troop levels ranging from 100,000 to 200,000 during the early 1980s. While Vietnam and Soviet-aligned states recognized the People's Republic, many Western and ASEAN countries continued to recognize Democratic Kampuchea's representatives at the United Nations. On the 21st of September, 1979, the UN General Assembly voted to allow the Khmer Rouge delegation to retain Cambodia's seat despite Vietnam's objections. China strongly condemned Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia, characterizing it as hegemonism and a threat to regional balance. In February and March 1979, China launched a brief but intense punitive attack on northern Vietnam, known as the Sino-Vietnamese War, partly in response to Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia. ASEAN members including Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines also opposed Vietnam's intervention and called for withdrawal of Vietnamese troops. Thailand, sharing a long border with Cambodia, became a rear area for anti-Vietnamese Cambodian resistance factions, including remnants of the Khmer Rouge and non-communist groups. The United States, having no diplomatic relations with Vietnam at the time, aligned with China and ASEAN in condemning the Vietnamese occupation and supported UN resolutions critical of Hanoi's actions. The Soviet Union backed Vietnam diplomatically and materially, viewing the intervention as a check on Chinese influence in Southeast Asia. Subsequent Cold War alignments in the region framed the Cambodian-Vietnamese conflict as part of a wider Third Indochina War involving Vietnam, Cambodia, China, and ASEAN states in a complex web of rivalries and alliances that would persist throughout the 1980s. After the fall of Phnom Penh in January 1979, Khmer Rouge forces regrouped in remote areas near the Thai-Cambodian border and continued guerrilla warfare against the Vietnamese-backed People's Republic of Kampuchea. Throughout the 1980s, the armed Cambodian opposition consisted of three main factions, with very different ideologies and backgrounds. These were the Khmer Rouge, now operating as the Party of Democratic Kampuchea, Prince Norodom Sihanouk's royalist forces known as Phun Sinpec, and the non-communist Khmer People's National Liberation Front, led by former Prime Minister Son Sann. The People's Republic of Kampuchea government in Phnom Penh, backed by Vietnam and the Soviet bloc, controlled most populated areas while insurgent forces held bases and operated from the Thai border region in the mountainous jungles. In 1979 and 1980, ASEAN states and China encouraged Sihanouk and Son Sann to cooperate with the Khmer Rouge to form a united anti-Vietnamese front, despite the Khmer Rouge's horrific record of genocide and mass atrocities that had killed roughly 2 million Cambodians during their brutal rule from 1975 to 1979. In January 1980, Son Sann announced plans for an anti-Vietnamese united front with the Khmer Rouge on condition that Pol Pot stepped aside and ceded power to his proposed organization. Negotiations among Sihanouk, Son Sann, and Khmer Rouge representative Khieu Samphan in 1979 through 1982 aimed to create a coalition that could claim Cambodia's international representation at the United Nations and present a unified opposition to Vietnam's occupation. On the 22nd of June, 1982, Prince Sihanouk, Sun San, and Khieu Samphan signed an agreement in Kuala Lumpur to form the Coalition Government of Democratic Kampuchea. This tripartite government in exile was composed of Phun Pek, the Khmer People's National Liberation Front, and the Party of Democratic Kampuchea. Under the 1982 agreement, Prince Norodom Sihanouk became president of the coalition. Sun San served as prime minister, and Khieu Samphan as deputy prime minister and foreign minister. Although nominally tripartite, the Khmer Rouge retained the largest and best armed forces within the coalition, giving it considerable influence over military activities conducted in the name of the government in exile. From 1979 until 1982, the United Nations seat for Cambodia continued to be held by representatives of Democratic Kampuchea, the Khmer Rouge regime that had perpetrated genocide against its own people. The United States, China, and several Western countries voted repeatedly to allow Democratic Kampuchea to retain Cambodia's UN seat, arguing that unseating it would legitimize Vietnam's invasion. A 1980 United Nations vote saw 71 countries supporting continued seating of the Khmer Rouge, 35 voting against, and 34 abstaining in a decision that drew criticism from human rights advocates around the world. After formation of the coalition government in 1982, the UN seat was assigned to the coalition rather than to the People's Republic, though the Khmer Rouge remained a dominant component. The coalition's flag, closely associated with the former Democratic Kampuchea, continued to fly at United Nations headquarters in New York throughout the 1980s. Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia, estimated at 100,000 to 200,000 troops in the early 1980s, drew broad international criticism as an infringement of Cambodian sovereignty despite ending the genocide. The UN General Assembly passed yearly resolutions in the 1980s calling for the withdrawal of foreign forces from Cambodia and respect for its independence. The United States already had sanctions in place against Vietnam and used diplomatic influence to block Vietnamese and People's Republic access to loans from the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and Asian Development Bank. As a result, Vietnam and the People's Republic were denied much-needed reconstruction funds and remained economically isolated from major international financial institutions throughout the decade. China, which had fought a brief war with Vietnam in 1979, continued through the 1980s to supply military and logistical assistance to anti-Vietnamese resistance groups along the Thai border. ASEAN governments maintained a diplomatic stance that condemned Vietnam's occupation and supported a political solution based on withdrawal and self-determination for Cambodia. Thailand, sharing a long border with Cambodia, allowed coalition factions to maintain bases and refugee camps along its frontier while officially denying direct military involvement. The Soviet Union provided substantial economic and military aid to Vietnam and the People's Republic, viewing them as allies in the regional balance against China. Throughout the 1980s, People's Republic security forces with Vietnamese support fought insurgent attacks, ambushes, and shelling from Khmer Rouge and non-communist resistance units operating from border sanctuaries. The continued fighting, landmine usage, and insecurity in rural Cambodia impeded agricultural recovery and reconstruction efforts across the war-torn country where millions struggled to rebuild their lives. Vietnamese official narratives describe their presence in Cambodia as fulfilling an internationalist duty to defend Cambodians from the return of the Khmer Rouge who had murdered so many innocent people. However, by the early 1980s, Vietnamese leaders recognized that long-term occupation was costly and contributed to diplomatic isolation and economic strain on their already struggling economy. The protracted conflict, sanctions, and costs of stationing large forces abroad placed additional burdens on Vietnam's centrally planned economy that was already facing serious difficulties. Some analyses link Vietnam's later decision to pursue Doi Mo economic reforms partly to lessons drawn from the isolation and resource drain of the Cambodian intervention. In the mid-1980s, Soviet policy changes under Mikhail Gorbachev, including détente with China, reduced Moscow's willingness to underwrite indefinite Vietnamese operations in Cambodia. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the Cambodian question intensified from the mid-1980s, involving ASEAN states, Vietnam, China, the Soviet Union, and Western powers in complex multilateral negotiations. Informal talks in Jakarta and other venues explored formulas for a political settlement, including ceasefires, withdrawal timetables, and power-sharing arrangements among the various factions. Vietnam announced in 1985 that it would begin a phased withdrawal of its troops from Cambodia, signaling readiness for a negotiated solution to end the costly conflict. In 1986 and 1987, Vietnam conducted partial troop withdrawals, though substantial forces remained in support of the People's Republic government. Inter-party contacts between Chinese and Vietnamese Communist parties in late 1988 eased tensions and helped clear the way for final withdrawal decisions. On the 5th of April 1989, Vietnam publicly abandoned preconditions it had previously set for a full troop withdrawal from Cambodia. Later that year, Vietnam completed the formal withdrawal of its remaining combat troops from Cambodia by late September 1989. Vietnamese state media marked the withdrawal with tributes to soldiers for having completed their internationalist duty in Cambodia over the preceding decade of occupation and combat. Even after the withdrawal, the Cambodian civil war continued among factions including the People's Republic government, now rebranded as the State of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, Phun Sinh Pech, and the Khmer People's National Liberation Front. The 1989 withdrawal removed a major obstacle to comprehensive peace negotiations and improved Vietnam's standing with ASEAN and Western countries. In 1987 and 1988, Prince Sihanouk held direct talks with Hun Sen, the People's Republic Prime Minister, in an effort to find a framework for national reconciliation. International conferences on Cambodia in the late 1980s, including meetings in Paris, sought to define a political settlement involving elections and a United Nations role in administering the transition. The concept of a comprehensive peace plan with UN supervision and power sharing among Cambodian factions gained ground by the end of the decade. The coalition continued to serve as Cambodia's UN representative throughout the 1980s, even as diplomatic momentum shifted toward an inclusive settlement that would eventually phase out its role. By 1989, broad outlines of what became the 1991 Paris peace agreements were emerging, including complete Vietnamese withdrawal, a UN transitional authority, disarmament of factions, and internationally supervised elections. Throughout this period, hundreds of thousands of Cambodian civilians lived in or around refugee camps along the Thai-Cambodian border, supported by international relief agencies while the factions fought on. Humanitarian organizations operating in these border camps had to navigate the presence of armed factions, including Khmer Rouge elements, alongside the civilian populations they served. The combination of ongoing guerrilla warfare, external backing for different Cambodian factions, and Cold War rivalries prolonged the conflict for a full decade after the fall of Phnom Penh in 1979, bridging Vietnam's initial overthrow of the Khmer Rouge and the later UN-brokered peace process. By the late 1970s, relations between China and Vietnam had deteriorated sharply over Vietnam's alliance with the Soviet Union, its intervention in Cambodia, and disputes over the ethnic Chinese population known as the Hoa living in Vietnam. China viewed Vietnam's 1978 invasion of Cambodia and overthrow of the Chinese-backed Khmer Rouge as a major strategic setback in Southeast Asia, threatening Beijing's influence in the region and challenging what it saw as the natural balance of power among communist states. Vietnam's 1978 Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation with the Soviet Union signaled a clear alignment with Moscow, which Beijing regarded as hostile to Chinese interests and as an encirclement strategy that threatened China from both north and south. Tensions also arose over Vietnam's policies toward its ethnic Chinese population, including expulsions and departures across the land border in 1978 that displaced hundreds of thousands of people who had lived in Vietnam for generations. Bilateral border talks held in 1977 and 1978 failed to resolve long-standing territorial and ethnic issues, contributing to the shift toward armed confrontation between the two communist neighbors who had once been allies in the struggle against American intervention. On the 17th of February 1979, at about 5 in the morning, China launched a large-scale ground invasion across its border with northern Vietnam, initiating what became known as the Sino-Vietnamese War. Chinese state statements described the operation as a punitive war intended to teach Vietnam a lesson for its actions in Cambodia and toward China's allies. The invasion involved forces from the People's Liberation Army main force units drawn from the Kunming, Chengdu, Wuhan, and Guangzhou military regions, representing a significant mobilization of China's ground forces. Estimates of Chinese troop strength committed to the initial assault range from about 200,000 to more than 500,000 soldiers, depending on the source consulted. Vietnam's border defenses were held by regular People's Army of Vietnam units, local militia, and border guards, while main forces remained partly tied down in Cambodia, supporting the new government there against continuing Khmer Rouge resistance. The Chinese attack targeted three main axes advancing into Vietnamese territory. In the east, forces moved toward Lang Son, a strategic gateway on Route 1 leading toward Hanoi. In the center, Chinese troops pushed towards Cao Bang, attempting to seize control of key mountain passes and road junctions that controlled access to the interior. In the northwest, People's Liberation Army forces advanced along routes from Yunnan into the Red River headwaters region toward Lao Cai, threatening the historic route into the northern highlands. The attacking forces used intensive artillery preparation, followed by infantry assaults on fortified Vietnamese positions along these axes. Heavy fighting occurred around Lang Son, where Vietnamese defenders put up determined resistance against the advancing Chinese columns. The mountainous terrain favored defensive positions, and Vietnamese forces made the attackers pay heavily for each kilometer of ground gained. The war lasted for about 1 month before China announced a ceasefire on the 16th of March 1979 and completed withdrawal of most forces by mid-March. Chinese forces occupied and then destroyed or damaged infrastructure in several border towns, including Lang Son and Cao Bang, before pulling back to their side of the frontier. The deliberate destruction of roads, bridges, and public buildings served as a final demonstration of Chinese military capability before the withdrawal. The conflict was largely confined to ground operations, with no significant use of air or naval power by either side. International observers generally agree that pre-war borders were not substantially altered by the brief but intense conflict. Both Beijing and Hanoi claimed victory in the aftermath of the fighting. China asserted it had punished Vietnam as intended, while Vietnam emphasized successful defense of its territory and the rapid withdrawal of People's Liberation Army forces. Casualty estimates for the war vary widely, with both governments releasing divergent figures and no official comprehensive counts available. External studies often estimate about 26,000 Chinese soldiers killed and 20,000 to 30,000 Vietnamese soldiers killed in the month of fighting. Some Western analyses suggest total Chinese casualties, including wounded, at roughly 30,000 to 60,000 personnel. Chinese sources claim to have inflicted more than 50,000 Vietnamese casualties, while Vietnamese sources claimed over 60,000 Chinese killed, illustrating the politicized nature of wartime reporting on both sides. Vietnamese sources also reported extensive damage to industry, agriculture, and civilian infrastructure in the border provinces from the People's Liberation Army incursion. After March 1979, China maintained troops in contested border areas and rebuilt fortifications on its side, while Vietnam reinforced its northern defenses against potential future attacks. The border remained tense and heavily militarized throughout the following decade. Border shelling and small unit clashes continued between the two countries throughout the 1980s, particularly in mountainous sectors such as Lao Cai and Lang Son. Recorded clashes occurred in at least June and October 1980, May 1981, April 1983, April 1984, June 1985, and October 1986 through January 1987. In June and July 1980, China shelled Cao Bang province to pressure Vietnam over its operations in Cambodia and relations with Thailand. In May 1981, intense fighting broke out in Khao Lak District, Lang Son province, around heights known as Pha Ka Shan and Kulin Shan. A major series of clashes took place in April and May 1984 around Laoshan and Zayinshan in Hajiang province. China described the 1984 Laoshan campaign as a local counterattack in self-defense to punish alleged Vietnamese incursions into Chinese-claimed territory. The fighting that spring was among the most intense since 1979. Vietnam reported in 1984 that it had annihilated 1 People's Liberation Army regiment and 8 battalions, claiming about 5,500 Chinese casualties during this 5-week offensive. Chinese accounts reported 939 soldiers and 64 laborers killed on their side in the same Laoshan fighting, and claimed about 2,000 Vietnamese casualties. People's Liberation Army forces maintained fortified positions on contested high ground until they gradually scaled down operations after 1987. From April 1987 to October 1989, People's Liberation Army activities on the border were reduced to patrols and a limited number of artillery strikes and small attacks. Border clashes also extended to the South China Sea, where in March 1988, Chinese and Vietnamese naval forces fought at Johnson South Reef in the Spratly Islands, resulting in Vietnamese ship losses and casualties that demonstrated how the conflict had spread beyond land borders. The ongoing conflicts compelled Vietnam to maintain large ground forces and fortifications in its northern provinces, adding significantly to defense expenditures that strained the already weak economy. China kept multiple armies garrisoned near the Vietnamese frontier and used periodic clashes to signal displeasure with Vietnam's continued occupation of Cambodia. Both countries' official narratives during the 1980s emphasized vigilance and readiness along the border, even as casualties and damage remained much lower than in 1979. The broader Sino-Vietnamese confrontation is often referred to as the Sino-Vietnamese conflicts spanning 1979 to 1991, encompassing the 1979 war and subsequent clashes until normalization of relations. Vietnam's gradual withdrawal from Cambodia in the late 1980s removed one of the main triggers for continued Chinese pressure along the border and opened the possibility for improved relations. Shifts in global politics, particularly Sino-Soviet rapprochement and the Soviet Union's decline changed the strategic calculus for both Beijing and Hanoi. From mid-1989, China and Vietnam began exploratory contacts on normalizing relations, linked to developments in Cambodia and regional diplomacy. Border trade between Vietnam and China's Guangxi region resumed on a limited basis in 1989, signaling tentative economic engagement despite unresolved political issues. On the 11th of August, 1989, following regional changes, China and Vietnam began formal talks on normalization of relations. In September 1990, senior leaders from both countries met secretly in Chengdu, Sichuan province, to discuss principles for normalizing ties and managing remaining disputes. Formal normalization of diplomatic relations was announced in November 1991 after Vietnam had completed its troop withdrawal from Cambodia and the Soviet Union was near collapse. A joint communiqué of November 1991 committed China and Vietnam to settle boundary and territorial issues peacefully through negotiations, opening a new chapter in their complex relationship. Historians generally interpret the 1979 war and the 1980s border clashes as both a reaction to Vietnam's regional policies and a crucial factor shaping subsequent Sino-Vietnamese normalization, as well as Vietnam's eventual search for broader international integration beyond its traditional reliance on Soviet support. After reunification in 1975, Vietnam adopted a highly centralized Soviet-style planned economy, with state ownership of major industry and extensive collectivization in agriculture. The model that had been built in the North over 2 decades was now to be extended across the entire country, bringing the South's market-oriented economy under the same system of central direction and collective organization that governed life above the 17th parallel. The second 5-year plan, covering 1976 through 1980, sought rapid industrialization and high growth, but coincided with severe post-war damage, resource shortages, and limited external financing. Official plan targets included annual industrial growth of 16 to 18% and agricultural growth of 8 to 10%, figures that reflected revolutionary optimism more than realistic assessment of the country's capacity. A World Bank report later noted that during this period, Vietnam's gross national product growth was roughly half the population growth rate, implying declining per capita income for millions of Vietnamese families. The economy in the late 1970s suffered from imbalances between investment in heavy industry and the availability of food, consumer goods, and foreign exchange. By the end of the decade, Vietnam faced chronic shortages of food, fuel, and basic consumer items, compounded by war damage and weak infrastructure. A dual-price system emerged, with state-set prices and rations coexisting with higher free market prices that reflected scarcity and the inadequacy of official distribution channels. Inflation became a persistent and worsening problem. Studies of inflation in Vietnam describe the period from 1980 to 1984 as marked by very high average annual inflation of about 165%. Consumer price inflation reached roughly 200% in 1982, despite official price controls that were supposed to maintain stability. High inflation coexisted with shortages, because monetary expansion, budget deficits, and state enterprise subsidies created excess demand relative to constrained supply. Vietnam's budget deficits in the early 1980s were largely financed by credit expansion from the state banking system, adding to inflationary pressures that eroded the purchasing power of wages and savings. The state's large subsidies to loss-making state enterprises absorbed significant fiscal resources without generating corresponding increases in output. Western and Vietnamese analyses describe monetary overhang in this period as households accumulated money they could not spend on scarce goods, contributing to repressed inflation that would eventually break into the open. Rationing systems for food and essential goods persisted into the 1980s, particularly in urban areas and for state employees. Agricultural output struggled to meet population needs despite the South's fertile regions due to collectivization problems, input shortages, and general insecurity. State procurement quotas required cooperatives and farmers to deliver fixed amounts of grain at low official prices, dampening incentives for surplus production that might have eased the food situation. Vietnam remained a net food importer in several years of the early 1980s, contrary to initial expectations that the Mekong Delta would generate large export surpluses that could finance industrial development. Industrial plants operated below capacity because of irregular supplies of electricity, fuel, raw materials, and spare parts. State investment reached about 19% of national income, but the efficiency of that investment was low, with many projects failing to deliver expected returns. The American trade embargo and Vietnam's limited access to World Bank and International Monetary Fund lending constrained imports of technology and equipment that might have improved productivity. The heavy burden of military expenditures, including Vietnam's forces in Cambodia and large northern border deployments against China, further strained state finances. Soviet and Comcon aid provided oil, machinery, and credit, but did not fully offset Vietnam's isolation from Western capital and markets. By the early 1980s, external debt had grown significantly, and repayment capacity was limited by low export earnings. The combination of high inflation, stagnating per capita output, and persistent shortages led internal party documents to describe the economy as in a crisis situation by the mid-1980s. Unemployment and underemployment remained serious problems, especially among urban youth and demobilized soldiers who struggled to find productive work in an economy that could not generate enough jobs. Even before the formal adoption of renovation policy, Vietnam experimented with limited reforms aimed at improving incentives and efficiency within the socialist framework. In 1981, the party secretariat issued Directive 100, introducing a new agricultural contract system that shifted production responsibility from cooperatives to households. Under this system, cooperatives contracted land and production targets to groups or households, which delivered a quota to the state and could keep or sell above quota output. The contract system led to some increases in agricultural production, especially rice, by strengthening household incentives to work harder and invest in their plots. However, incomplete price reforms meant that increases in supply interacted with continued monetary overhang, contributing to high inflation in 1982 even as more food reached markets. In industry, early 1980s reforms allowed state enterprises limited autonomy to operate outside the plan and retain part of their profits from above-plan production. Decision 25CP in 1981 and related measures gave enterprises more discretion in input procurement and output sales within broad plan constraints. Under Decision 25CP, factories could prepare three-part plans covering state-assigned tasks, self-devised production, and a third plan for auxiliary activities that brought in additional revenue. These reforms allowed enterprises limited flexibility to procure inputs and sell part of their output outside rigid state quotas, aiming to raise efficiency by giving managers more room to respond to actual conditions rather than abstract plan targets. These partial reforms created a three-plan system combining mandatory plan tasks, additional negotiated tasks, and enterprise-initiated production that introduced some market elements into the planned framework. Despite some gains, policy inconsistency and periodic crackdowns on what authorities called economic anarchy limited the extent of de facto marketization in the early 1980s. The Fifth Party Congress in 1982 acknowledged economic difficulties and endorsed shifts toward more emphasis on agriculture, light industry, and exports. Inflation accelerated again in the mid-1980s, with estimates putting annual inflation above 400% in 1985 and above 700% in 1986. In 1985, the government carried out a major currency reform, redenominating the dong and attempting to unify official and market prices. The reform sought to raise official prices closer to market levels while increasing wages and tightening credit. Instead of stabilizing the economy, the 1985 reform triggered further inflation as price liberalization outpaced improvements in supply and fiscal discipline. By 1986, Vietnam's leadership faced simultaneous problems of hyperinflation, stagnation, low living standards, and popular dissatisfaction with distribution systems. Within the Communist Party, debates intensified over the balance between central planning and market mechanisms, as well as over the role of the non-state sector. Reform-minded officials argued for acknowledging a multi-component economy, including household, private, and foreign-invested sectors alongside state enterprises. Party critics of the existing model highlighted inefficiencies in state enterprises, excessive bureaucratic control, and corruption within management structures. Leading figures noted in internal discussions that the party apparatus had become cumbersome and only marginally efficient, with poorly divided responsibilities that hampered decision-making at every level. These critiques shaped preparations for the Sixth National Congress of the Communist Party, convened in Hanoi in December 1986, which would mark a turning point in Vietnam's economic history. The Sixth National Congress met from the 15th to the 18th of December 1986 and is widely regarded as the formal starting point of the Doi Moi, or renovation, policy. The Congress elected Nguyen Van Linh as General Secretary, replacing Trung Chin, and signaled a leadership shift toward reform-oriented figures who recognized that fundamental changes were necessary. In its political report, the Congress called for renovation of economic management, restructuring of production, and greater use of market mechanisms under socialist orientation. The Congress endorsed key points including prioritizing food, consumer goods, and export production, decentralizing aspects of economic management, and recognizing a mixed economy that included non-state sectors. Vietnamese and international analyses identify Doi Mo as a response to the accumulated economic crisis of 1976 to 1986, seeking to maintain socialist political structures while adopting more market-oriented economic policies that would transform the country in the decades ahead. The Oimo reform line adopted at the Sixth Party Congress in December 1986 called for shifting from a rigid central plan toward what Vietnamese leaders described as a multi-component socialist-oriented market economy. The policy maintained the Communist Party's political monopoly while redefining economic management to include state, collective, private, and foreign-invested sectors alongside one another. The period from 1986 through 1990 is commonly treated as the initial implementation phase of Doi Moi, when key legal and policy changes began to be rolled out across the country. One core objective in the late 1980s was macroeconomic stabilization, reducing the hyperinflation that had eroded living standards and disrupted economic planning throughout the middle of the decade. At the same time, policy documents emphasized increasing production of food and consumer goods to address the chronic shortages that had plagued Vietnamese households for years. Export promotion and deeper integration into regional and global trade were identified as new sources of growth that could reduce Vietnam's dependence on Soviet bloc assistance. In agriculture, Politburo Resolution 10, issued on the 5th of April 1988, was a landmark reform of the management of the agricultural economy. The resolution allocated collective land to individual farm households on long-term contracts, typically 10 to 15 years, turning them into what officials called basic autonomous economic units. Under Resolution 10, farm households received the right to make key decisions on investment, crop choice, and marketing of their output after fulfilling contractual obligations to the state and collective. The reform extended and deepened an earlier 1981 contract system by lengthening contract duration and reducing compulsory deliveries to the state that had dampened production incentives. Cooperatives in many areas were redefined to focus on services such as irrigation, input supply, and plant protection rather than direct management of production itself. Resolution 10 effectively ended the system of compulsory state procurement in agriculture and abolished the two-tier price system for farm products that had created distortions and discouraged farmers from bringing surplus to market. The 1988 land law recognized households as production entities and granted them land use rights for long-term use, though formal private ownership of land remained absent from the legal framework. The land law and Resolution 10 together increased tenure security for farmers, encouraging greater investment in land improvement and diversification of crops. Farmers were permitted to sell surplus produce on the free market once contractual deliveries were met, improving their cash incomes and giving them reason to work harder on their plots. These changes contributed to rapid increases in rice production by the late 1980s, positioning Vietnam to move from chronic food shortages toward food self-sufficiency and eventually to become a major rice exporter. By the end of the 1980s, Vietnam had become a net rice exporter, reversing its earlier dependence on food imports that had strained the balance of payments. On the industrial side, Council of Ministers Decree 188 of 1987 expanded the autonomy of state enterprises in planning, finance, and labor management. State enterprises were granted more discretion to procure inputs, set output mixes, and negotiate contracts, while still expected to meet broad plan guidelines. A shift began from direct physical planning toward indirect management, using financial tools such as credit limits, interest rates, and taxes that allowed market signals to influence enterprise decisions. Price reforms in 1989 liberalized most prices, including agricultural producer prices, interest rates, and the exchange rate. The 1989 reforms substantially reduced the gap between official and market prices, helping to unify the internal price system and eliminate the distortions that had encouraged black markets and speculation. In December 1987, Vietnam enacted its first law on foreign investment, opening the country to foreign direct investment through joint ventures and other forms of collaboration with international capital. The 1987 Foreign Investment Law allowed foreign investors to own up to 100% of the capital in some projects, although in practice, most early ventures were joint ventures with state enterprises. Incentives in the law included tax holidays, profit remittance provisions, and guarantees against nationalization without compensation. Early foreign direct investment in the late 1980s concentrated in light manufacturing, hotels, and oil and gas exploration, often in partnership with large state-owned firms. Although annual foreign direct investment flows remained modest before 1990, the legal framework signaled Vietnam's intention to attract foreign capital and technology that could modernize its economy. External trade policy was gradually liberalized, with reductions in quantitative restrictions and a move toward tariff-based regulation that aligned with international practice. Export-oriented investment, particularly in oil, seafood, and light manufacturing, was encouraged as a way to earn foreign exchange. In 1989, Vietnam unified the exchange rate, devaluing the official rate to approximate the market rate and improving incentives for exports and remittances. The combination of exchange rate unification and price liberalization in 1989 played a central role in stabilizing inflation that had reached catastrophic levels just a few years earlier. After peaking at very high levels in 1986, inflation fell sharply by 1990 as monetary growth was restrained and fiscal deficits narrowed. Real gross domestic product growth rose from low or negative rates in the early 1980s to around 4 to 5% by the late 1980s, a significant turnaround from the crisis years. Agricultural growth in particular supported overall expansion, as higher farm output cushioned the adjustment of state industry to new conditions. Rising agricultural incomes in many rural areas were accompanied by growth in rural markets, including small shops, input dealers, and transport services that connected farmers to buyers and suppliers. State enterprises underwent restructuring, with some loss-making units closed or merged, though the state sector remained dominant in key industries such as energy, telecommunications, and heavy manufacturing. In urban areas, Doi Mo led to a gradual relaxation of restrictions on small private businesses such as family shops, workshops, and services that had operated in the shadows of the planned economy. Households could obtain business licenses more easily than under previous regulations, enabling legal operation of many formerly informal activities. The emerging private sector became visible in retail trade, street vending, repair services, and small-scale manufacturing, particularly in the cities of the South where entrepreneurial traditions had never entirely disappeared despite years of socialist transformation. While state distribution networks continued to function, markets and privately run stalls increasingly became the primary source of goods for many urban residents who found selection and quality better outside official channels. Despite market-oriented reforms, the Communist Party of Vietnam retained centralized political authority and continued to set broad economic directions. Party documents emphasized that Doi Mo was a renovation within socialism, not a transition to capitalism, and maintained commitments to public ownership in strategic sectors. The state continued to own all land, with households holding long-term, inheritable use rights rather than full private property titles. Central planning institutions were not abolished, but reoriented to use planning as a framework, with greater reliance on market signals and indirect controls. New commercial laws and regulations in the late 1980s began to clarify the legal status of private, collective, and state enterprises under the evolving mixed economy. Wage reforms and partial delinking of wages from rigid state scales began, with more scope to reward productivity within enterprises. The government sought to create incentives for workers and managers alike to contribute to improved performance. Internationally, Doi Mo and troop withdrawal from Cambodia improved Vietnam's relations with ASEAN countries and Western donors in the late 1980s. Vietnam normalized relations with the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and other international financial institutions in the early 1990s, building on reforms initiated in 1986 through 1990. Early Doi Mo successes in stabilizing inflation and boosting agricultural production were widely cited in later assessments as crucial to regaining donor confidence. The main reform directions identified in 1986 through 1990, including export orientation, multi-sectoral economy, and price and trade liberalization, remained pillars of Vietnam's strategy into the 1990s and beyond. Scholars commonly treat the 1986 through 1990 period as the foundational phase of Doi Mo, during which Vietnam moved from crisis under central planning toward a more market-responsive, outward-looking economic system while preserving one-party rule that maintained political stability amid rapid economic change. After Vietnam's intervention in Cambodia in 1978 and 1979 and the border war with China that same year, relations with both China and most ASEAN states were severely strained, leaving Vietnam regionally isolated through the early 1980s. Throughout that decade, normalization of relations with China and ASEAN was closely linked to resolving the Cambodian conflict and withdrawing Vietnamese troops from that country. Vietnam's gradual exit from Cambodia, completed in 1989, was a precondition for improved ties with both China and ASEAN member states. The dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War reduced Vietnam's reliance on Moscow and encouraged diversification of foreign relations that would no longer depend on alignment with a single superpower. Vietnam's foreign policy doctrine in the late 1980s and early 1990s shifted toward what officials described as multi-directional or multilateral relations, seeking broader international integration that could support economic development and ensure national security. China and Vietnam began signaling interest in improved ties after Vietnam's announcements between 1985 and 1988 of phased troop withdrawals from Cambodia. In September 1990, senior leaders from China and Vietnam held a secret summit in Chengdu, Sichuan province, to discuss normalizing relations after more than a decade of hostility. The Chengdu meeting involved Chinese leaders Jiang Zemin and Li Peng, along with Vietnamese leaders Do Muir and Nguyen Van Linh, among others. Discussions at Chengdu focused on Cambodia, normalization principles, and future economic and political cooperation between the two communist neighbors. On the 19th through 24th of August, 1991, Vietnamese Foreign Minister Nguyen Minh Cum visited Beijing in the highest-level Vietnamese visit since 1979. A joint communiqué issued at the end of the August 1991 visit stated that both countries were ready to restore exchanges and cooperation in economics, trade, science, transportation, and culture. The communiqué emphasized that future China-Vietnam relations would be based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that had long guided relations among socialist and non-aligned states. On the 5th of November 1991, China and Vietnam officially announced the normalization of state and party relations in Beijing. General Secretary Do Muir and Prime Minister Vo Van Kiet attended the November 1991 normalization events in the Great Hall of the People. A joint communiqué on the 10th of November 1991 committed both sides to settle boundary and other territorial issues peacefully through negotiations rather than force. Following normalization, China and Vietnam established 3 expert working groups to address land border, Gulf of Tonkin, and South China Sea issues that remained unresolved from the years of conflict. In 1993, the two sides signed an agreement on basic principles for handling border and territory questions, providing a procedural framework for negotiations that would continue for years. Subsequent high-level exchanges in the early 1990s included visits by party and government delegations, signaling a shift from confrontation to cautious cooperation. Border trade between Vietnam and China's Guangxi and Yunnan provinces expanded after normalization, benefiting frontier economies on both sides. Despite normalization, detailed agreements on land borders and maritime demarcation would only be completed later in the 1990s and early 2000s. ASEAN states had viewed Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia as a central obstacle to closer relations during the 1980s. After Vietnamese troops withdrew from Cambodia in 1989 and the Paris peace agreements were signed in 1991, ASEAN governments shifted toward engagement with Hanoi. Thai Prime Minister Chatichai Chunhavan's 1989 call to turn battlefields into marketplaces symbolized ASEAN's move from confrontation to cooperation with Indochina. In 1993, during a visit to Thailand, Vietnamese General Secretary Do Muir outlined a four-point policy toward ASEAN and expressed Vietnam's willingness to join the organization at an appropriate time. In May 1994, President Le Duc Anh, visiting Indonesia, announced that Vietnam was working to become an ASEAN full member as soon as possible. Vietnam acceded to ASEAN on the 28th of July 1995 at the 28th ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Brunei, becoming the organization's seventh member. Vietnam's ASEAN membership marked a strategic decision to integrate into regional political and economic structures after years of isolation. Upon joining, Vietnam aligned itself with ASEAN's principles of non-interference, consensus decision-making, and peaceful dispute resolution. Vietnam participated in ASEAN's efforts to narrow development gaps through initiatives designed to support newer members. In 1998, Vietnam hosted the ASEAN Summit in Hanoi, reaffirming support for core ASEAN norms in the Hanoi Declaration. The United States had maintained a trade embargo on Vietnam from the mid-1960s until the early 1990s, citing unresolved prisoner of war and missing in action issues as well as concerns over Cambodia. In the early 1990s, Presidents George H.W. Bush and later Bill Clinton linked progress on these issues and Cambodia to potential easing of sanctions against Vietnam. In July 1993, the United States lifted its opposition to Vietnam receiving international financial institution aid, allowing the World Bank and International Monetary Fund to resume lending that had been blocked for years. On the 3rd of February 1994, President Bill Clinton formally lifted the American trade embargo against Vietnam, ending nearly 3 decades of economic restrictions that had isolated the Vietnamese economy from its largest potential market. On the 11th of July, 1995, the United States and Vietnam announced the establishment of full diplomatic relations, closing a chapter that had begun with American military intervention decades earlier. After normalization, the United States opened an embassy in Hanoi, and Vietnam opened an embassy in Washington, marking a new phase of bilateral engagement between former enemies. The lifting of the embargo in 1994 and diplomatic normalization in 1995 laid the groundwork for rapid growth in bilateral trade in subsequent decades that would make the United States one of Vietnam's most important economic partners. Other Western countries, including members of the European Community, had already normalized relations and restarted aid and trade with Vietnam earlier in the late 1980s and early 1990s, providing models for engagement. Japan resumed official development assistance to Vietnam in 1992, becoming one of its largest bilateral donors and providing crucial support for infrastructure development. By the mid-1990s, multilateral donors such as the World Bank and Asian Development Bank had active lending portfolios in Vietnam focused on infrastructure, agriculture, and structural reforms that aligned with the Doi Moi agenda. Vietnam had joined the International Monetary Fund and World Bank in the 1950s, but only reactivated borrowing and program relationships in the early 1990s after policy shifts and improved external relations created conditions for renewed engagement. The return of international financial institutions to Vietnam represented a vote of confidence in the reform process and opened access to technical assistance and concessional lending that supported continued transformation of the economy. In November 1993, an international donors conference in Paris pledged significant aid to support Vietnam's reform and reconstruction efforts. The normalization of relations with China in 1991, ASEAN accession in 1995, and American diplomatic normalization in 1995 collectively marked Vietnam's emergence from Cold War-era isolation into a new era of international engagement. By 1995, Vietnam had diplomatic relations with most United Nations member states and was increasingly integrated into regional forums, such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, that addressed security issues through dialogue. Vietnam's step-by-step normalization strategy paralleled its internal Doi Mo reforms, with foreign policy recalibration seen as essential to attracting investment, aid, and trade that could support economic development and improve living standards. China-Vietnam relations after 1991 gradually shifted from security confrontation to pragmatic cooperation, especially in economics and border management. Successive China-Vietnam joint communiques in 1991, 1994, and 1995 reaffirmed principles for peaceful settlement of border and maritime disputes that had contributed to war just over a decade earlier. In the 1990s, China and Vietnam expanded frontier trade, joint economic projects, and high-level party-to-party exchanges while continuing negotiations on outstanding territorial issues. ASEAN membership provided Vietnam with a multilateral platform for managing relations with both China and other external powers in a regional framework that emphasized dialogue over confrontation. Scholars generally interpret the period from 1979 through 1995 as Vietnam's transition from isolation and conflict toward normalized relations with China, ASEAN, the United States, and global institutions, enabling fuller integration into the regional and world economy that had been denied during the long years of war and embargo. Vietnam's population grew from about 48 million in 1975 to roughly 66 or 67 million by 1990, reflecting high post-war fertility and declining mortality as the country moved from the devastation of conflict toward recovery. When Vietnam was reunified in 1975, its population had a youthful age structure and high fertility typical of a post-conflict developing country. Population growth slowed markedly in the 1980s as family planning policies expanded and fertility began to decline in response to both government programs and changing economic circumstances. The share of Vietnam's population living in urban areas remained relatively low, around or below 20% in 1990, indicating a largely rural society at that date. Between the 1979 census, which recorded 52.7 million people, and the 1989 census, which counted about 64.4 million, the country experienced rapid demographic expansion even as fertility rates began their decline. Government sources describe Vietnam's post-1975 demographic pattern as shaped by high birth rates in the late 1970s, followed by gradual fertility decline from the mid-1980s onward. Age dependency ratios in the 1980s remained high, with large cohorts of children relative to the working age population, a demographic structure that both challenged and promised future development. Internal migration during the years from 1975 through 1990 included state-organized resettlement to new economic zones, as well as spontaneous rural to urban migration that authorities sometimes tried to control but could not entirely prevent. These movements contributed to the early growth of cities such as Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, though large-scale urbanization accelerated only after 1990. By the early 1990s, Vietnam's leaders estimated that around 2 million people had left the country as refugees or immigrants since 1975, including boat people and those who departed overland. The Vietnamese diaspora is now commonly estimated at about 3 million people by the early 21st century, with its core formed by post-1975 refugee waves that scattered across dozens of countries. Major overseas Vietnamese communities had formed by 1990 in the United States, France, Australia, and Canada, as well as smaller groups across Western Europe and Asia. Vietnamese communities in socialist bloc countries such as the Soviet Union, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia developed mainly through contract labor and student programs in the 1980s, distinct from the refugee flows that reached Western countries. The overseas Vietnamese population, known as Viet Kieu, became increasingly recognized by Hanoi as a potential source of skills, investment, and remittances from the late 1980s onward as attitudes toward the diaspora began to shift. Inside Vietnam, post-war socialist policies emphasized collective organization of villages and neighborhoods through mass organizations such as the Women's Union and Youth Union that mobilized the population for party-led campaigns. Cooperative work structures in agriculture and state enterprises shaped daily rhythms of family life in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Ration cards and state distribution systems meant that many urban households relied on formal employment and party-linked channels for access to food and goods that were often in short supply. Extended families often pooled ration cards, informal market activity, and side jobs to maintain living standards under shortage conditions that tested resourcefulness and social bonds. Under Doi Mo, greater scope for household-based production and small trade increased the economic role of families as semi-autonomous units that could make their own decisions about work and investment. Education policy after reunification sought to standardize curricula nationwide, promote Vietnamese as the medium of instruction, and expand basic schooling to reach every child. Literacy rates, already relatively high in the North, improved further in the 1980s, while educational access in the former South was progressively expanded under the unified system. Communist ideology promoted formal gender equality in education and employment, and girls' school enrollment rose substantially in the post-1975 period as barriers to female education fell. Studies of youth in 1980s Vietnam note the coexistence of socialist ideals of collective duty with emerging consumer and popular culture influences toward the late Doi Moi years. Young people increasingly viewed educational attainment as central to upward mobility in both state and emerging market sectors, recognizing that credentials would open doors in the changing economy. Women's participation in the workforce was high in agriculture, industry, and services, reflecting both long-standing patterns and socialist labor mobilization that expected women to contribute alongside men. Research suggests that despite official gender equality rhetoric, family structures remained largely patriarchal, with women bearing substantial domestic responsibilities alongside paid work outside the home. Market reforms in the late 1980s opened new opportunities for women in petty trade and microenterprise, particularly in urban and peri-urban areas where small-scale commerce flourished. Sociological studies highlight continued gender gaps in access to formal sector jobs and decision-making positions even as women gained economic independence through market activities. Youth culture in cities began to incorporate foreign music, fashion, and leisure activities more visibly toward 1990, facilitated by limited opening and inflows of media from abroad. Overseas Vietnamese organizations, whether religious, cultural, or professional, played a central role in maintaining language, traditions, and community cohesion abroad during the years of exile. Vietnamese language newspapers, radio programs, and community centers appeared in major diaspora hubs such as Orange County, Paris, and Sydney during the 1980s. Many diaspora associations explicitly identified with the former Republic of Vietnam and used its symbols in community events and memorials. Religious institutions, including Buddhist temples and Catholic parishes, served as focal points for social networks and cultural transmission to second-generation Vietnamese growing up abroad. Diaspora youth navigated hybrid identities, combining elements of Vietnamese heritage with host country languages and schooling systems that shaped their worldview. Politically, much of the diaspora remained critical of the Hanoi government through 1990 and maintained limited direct contact with the homeland they had fled. Restrictions on return travel and currency transfers in the late 1970s and early 1980s constrained personal visits and remittances between families separated by oceans. As Doi Moi progressed, Vietnam gradually eased some restrictions on visits by overseas Vietnamese, especially for family reunions and tourism. The 1987 Foreign Investment Law and subsequent regulations signaled official openness to overseas Vietnamese investors alongside other foreign capital. By 1990, formal remittance flows were still modest compared with later decades, but early channels through banking, personal carriage, and informal systems were already emerging. The post-1975 decades left a dual legacy: a predominantly young, still largely rural population experiencing socialist transformation and early market reforms at home, and a sizable global diaspora maintaining dense cultural, familial, and eventually economic links with Vietnam that would deepen in the years ahead. Demographic and economic studies identify remittances from the diaspora as becoming increasingly important to household incomes in Vietnam during the 1990s, building on the kin networks formed in the years from 1975 through 1990. Early signs of transnational entrepreneurship included small import-export ventures linking diaspora traders with relatives and contacts in Vietnam's nascent private sector. Cultural exchanges, such as music recordings, videos, and printed materials circulated between overseas Vietnamese communities and contacts inside Vietnam, sometimes informally despite official restrictions. The presence of a sizable, skilled diaspora later provided Vietnam with a pool of potential return migrants, investors, and experts during deeper integration in the 1990s and 2000s. Scholars argue that the refugee waves, socialist restructuring, and Doi Mo reforms together generated a transnational Vietnamese social field, linking households, communities, and institutions across borders by 1990. Within Vietnam, poverty and limited consumer options characterized much of the late 1970s and early 1980s, but living standards began to improve in many areas after the late 1980s reforms took effect. Early doi moi contributed to diversification of livelihoods, with households combining farming, side businesses, and occasional wage work in ways that had been discouraged under strict central planning. Social researchers note that these shifts altered intra-household bargaining and generational relations as income increasingly came from multiple, often informal, sources rather than from state employment alone. By 1990, Vietnam remained relatively poor, but had moved away from the acute crisis of the early 1980s, setting the stage for broader social changes in the 1990s that would transform the country more profoundly than anyone could have anticipated. The transformation that had begun in the difficult years after 1975 was far from complete, but the foundations of a different Vietnam were being laid.